Now we're going to begin our course within a course. We're going to begin to look at Machiavelli's The Prince, a short work, but certainly his most famous work, the work from which the adjective Machiavellian comes. Now, Machiavelli, again, retired from his active political work in 1512. Of course, it was, as I pointed out in the biographical lecture, it was a forced retirement. Florence, we would say today, changed governments, and he was out. And furthermore, as I also pointed out in the last lecture, he was not only out of office, he decided it was probably in his best interest and probably good for his health to actually leave Florence and go live a few kilometers south of Florence in the countryside on the old Machiavelli estate, a rather modest villa by the standards of what we think of today when we think of a Renaissance villa, but nevertheless, not a bad place to live in the country. However, Machiavelli's forced retirement hardly kept him from being interested in and informed about politics in Florence. He really kept track of things. Again, he was free to go into the city when he wanted to, and he could literally see the city from his backyard. But also, he had a lot of news. He wrote letters. He corresponded with people not just in the immediate area, but also in Rome and so on. Let's put it this way. If Machiavelli were living in 2005 and had the same situation, we would say that he'd probably become a C-SPAN junkie. He really wanted to know what was going on in the politics. It was in his blood. Florence was in his blood. And so he kept track of things. But what's really interesting is while he was eager to get back to work, eager to get back into politics, we would say, he also had time to read, to contemplate, to think. At least I imagine Machiavelli as he's walking from one place on the farm to the other, not really pondering, gosh, how are the hogs doing today, but really pondering if I'd have done this differently, or if King Louis's troops do this, or if such and such happens, or if the Pope dies, or whatever it might be, then what are going to be the political fallouts from all of that sort of stuff. So Machiavelli was both almost still feverish in his interest in politics, and yet somewhat contemplative. And it was during these first months of his enforced retirement and his voluntary exile from the city of Florence that he indeed wrote The Prince. It was done by Christmas of 1513. I read to you in the last lecture a letter, or part of a letter, that Machiavelli wrote to his friend Francesco Vettori in Rome, sort of describing daily life, but also in particular describing his study and describing his writing as he was working in his little village of Sant'Andrea in Percusina. Now, he wrote The Prince quickly, in a matter of months. And a good question to ask is, well, why? What kind of a book is it? What was the purpose? What was he going to get out of it? What was the function of that work as he understood it, as he was writing it? Since he did, after all, send it on to Rome. And remember, Rome is important because there is a Medici Pope in Rome. Leo X is the Pope. And therefore, when he sends it to Rome, he is sending it to a seat of Medici power. In fact, this is a very important point to make. Remember earlier I mentioned there are 5 principal political powers in Italy, but that Italy was also subject to these foreign invasions beginning in 1494. Well, Machiavelli is really put off by the arrival of the French and the Spanish and all the rest of them. And once the, as he calls them in The Prince, the barbarians out of Italy. But there's a fortuitous series of events that's occurred as Machiavelli sees it, because now, at this moment, 2 of those 5 principal powers in Italy are held by the same family. That is to say, the Medici have come back to power in Florence, and there is a Medici on the papal throne, on the throne of St. Peter. And therefore, Machiavelli no doubt sees this as an opportunity that perhaps now he can see the Medici are the family that really need to take charge in Italy, that they're the ones, because of this fortuitous situation, the Medici return in Florence and the election of Leo X as Pope, that together the Medici can be the leaders of the Italians to, among other things, bring some law and order in Italy and throw out the barbarians, the foreign troops and invaders. And so one way people have traditionally read Machiavelli's The Prince is as a kind of work of flattery and even as a job application to the Medici. Because even though the Medici replaced the Republican government where Machiavelli had been an official, Machiavelli was a Florentine. And he wanted to go to work for the new government, although he was somewhat distrusted because of his identification with the previous regime. And so many see this as, hey, Medici, first of all, let me tell you, I love you guys. Certainly at the very beginning and at the very end of The Prince, and we'll talk about those pieces in detail at the appropriate time, certainly there's this sense of a little bit of flattery of the Medici. For example, although originally this was dedicated to a member of the Medici family who died very shortly after it was written, the dedication as it reads today is to Lorenzo de' Medici, not the one who died, of course, in 1492. Medici keep naming their kids the same things. It gets sort of confusing. But this is another Lorenzo de' Medici, whom he calls in the dedicatory letter, the Magnificent. Well, there wasn't much magnificent about this particular Lorenzo de' Medici. And so one sometimes sees it as a work of flattery and as a job application. This is what I think. This is how I would advise you. Hire me, hire me, hire me. That's one way to read what The Prince is. Let me suggest two other ways, however, that we can read The Prince. One is we're stunned by its newness. When we read this book, especially in a college great books course or wherever it might be, we think of it as something that just seems to come out of nowhere. There's never been a book like this before. Again, it's led to such titles that we give Machiavelli as the first modern man. Well, let me suggest that that's true and not true. Let me talk about the way it's not true, because it's true in obvious ways. For centuries, indeed for a millennium and a half, one can argue, there has been a genre of literature called A Mirror for Princes. Primarily, this was a medieval genre of literature, although it has been argued that the earliest one of these dates from around 400 BC and was written by the Greek Xenophon. That is to say, books of advice, books for princes to hold up as mirrors in their hands and look at themselves and examine themselves carefully, as you can do when you look in a good mirror. And so in many ways, although this book is startlingly new, it is, from another point of view, conventional in genre. It is simply the most famous of a whole body of literature, of manuals, or again, to use the better word, mirrors of princes. I was teaching a course last semester on the early Middle Ages, and we were reading a document from the 9th century, and sure enough, it's a mirror for princes, written by an advisor to one of the successors of Charlemagne. So it is important to say that although this is in some ways perhaps a job application, perhaps even a flattering job application, it is also from a traditional genre of literature, advice to mirrors for princes. In recent years, one of the great scholars of Machiavelli today, Maurizio Viroli, who teaches at Princeton, has written that, in fact, this is not a very flattering book to the Medici at all. That's a misreading of the text. In fact, what he wants to argue is this is a book that is deeply critical of the Medici. That doesn't mean it isn't a job application. But instead of saying, boy, you guys are great, boy, you guys are going to run a great regime, boy, I'd like to work for you, you're really cool, Viroli argues what this says is, look, hold this up as a mirror, and you will see that my advice is very different from the way you're acting, and you guys are messing things up. You guys are making big-time mistakes. And, of course, here's the other implication. You need me because, presumably, you aren't getting very good advice. You guys are not running things very well, and you're going to perpetuate or deepen the problems of Italy rather than solve them if you keep going the way you're going. So it may be, in fact, to attract the attention of the Medici and to show Machiavelli's own importance to the success of the Medici in Rome and in Florence. But, at least Viroli argues, it doesn't do it in a flattering way, it does it in a witheringly critical way. And so these are some of the ways that we can read the book as a whole. Let me turn now to asking, where does Machiavelli get his information? That is to say, there is, in addition to advice, a lot of information in this book. Information in the sense of examples of how things are done right, how things are done wrong. And therefore, we need to ask, where does Machiavelli look? Where do his examples and his stories and his illustrations come from? Because it is a well-illustrated book in terms of the specificity of detail, historical and contemporary. One thing it's worth saying is, if we simply make a list of the proper names, who gets mentioned in The Prince, you would find very quickly, with almost no exceptions, that the list really fall into two categories. Category one, ancient people, Greeks and Romans, some of whom are pretty well known to us still today, and some of whom are fairly obscure unless you've read a lot of Thucydides and some of the other Greek and Roman authors. So you will find Hannibal, for example. There's a big star. We know that name. We will also find a lot of what most people today would regard as fairly obscure ancient figures, although they're more obscure to us than they would be to the humanist educated people who were likely to read The Prince in the first place. The second big group of people are modern people, meaning from the 15th and early 16th century, many of the people whom Machiavelli mentions are in fact alive or very, very recently dead. Now, what I want you to notice is there's a gap. Because if you've got ancient people and, from Machiavelli's point of view, modern people, what you don't have is medieval people. That is to say, for roughly a 1,000-year period that we today roughly call the Middle Ages, remember I say this as a medievalist first and foremost, there is virtually no reference. We don't have reference to, some of the great kings of medieval Europe that we think of, Louis IX of France or Richard the Lion-Hearted or Edward I, the father of Parliament. None of those folks make it. That this is basically a study that largely compares ancient people and modern people with almost nothing in between. And in many ways, that's very typical of humanists in Florence in the 15th and 16th centuries. That is to say, it's very typical of the Renaissance. Again, the Renaissance is a period where we say stuff was born, stuff sort of died, stuff gets reborn. Well, if that's your view of things, then of course the dead period doesn't matter very much. That's not where you're going to draw the most important lessons. Those are not the writers you're going to look to for the most wisdom. And so it's very interesting to see this gap because Machiavelli is one of many of those humanists who, even without doing it in words, really creates the notion of ancient, medieval, and modern, with medieval sort of meaning barbaric and uninteresting and not very useful to us. And that Renaissance and later on Enlightenment view of the Middle Ages continued until modern times when the Middle Ages got discovered. After all, American universities had been teaching history a long time before Harvard hired the first medieval historian in the United States. By the way, that was Henry Adams, the famous 19th century scholar and thinker and member of the Adams family. That's Adams family, of course, with one D and not two. So I do want to emphasize that Machiavelli does enforce this humanist notion that the ancient world is a treasury of examples and wisdom from the past, and the modern world is the world upon which we are playing right now, and the world in between really isn't very interesting or valuable. Another point that's worth making as we begin to look at what Machiavelli talks about and doesn't talk about. He obviously deals with the church a great deal. After all, in every part of Europe, the church is a great landowner, a political power. The Bishop of Florence still counts in politics, But of course, most importantly for Machiavelli, he examines the role of the Pope, because the Papal States was one of the nations on the Italian peninsula, one of 5 that really mattered. There were some smaller ones. And therefore, he's constantly interested in talking about the papacy as a political entity, and as, in particular, a political entity governed by an official who has a spiritual job, the job of being the vicar of Christ and the Bishop of Rome and the successor of Peter. However, Machiavelli never is interested in theology. He never talks about traditional Christian teaching, morality, Christian ethics. Those concerns are not there. What the church teaches doesn't seem to be very interesting to him. He's interested in the church and religion as players in the realm of politics. He's not particularly interested in Christianity in terms of its religious belief or its ultimate goal of achieving salvation for those who adhere to the faith. It is, in that way, a very secular book. It is not to say that Machiavelli is an atheist. Far as we know, he went to church on Sundays. There are certainly times when he talks about the existence of God and God directing Moses and God opening the Red Sea as he retells the story of Moses from the book of Exodus. But he may have a kind of conventional and general belief in God, but he is really not interested in theology, in Christian morality, Christian ethics as a guide to politics. And therefore, although we should not call him irreligious, or perhaps even in his personal life non-religious, religious reasoning, religious motivation really doesn't enter into this or the other books of Machiavelli at all. He's famous toward the end of his life in having written a letter to a friend of his in which he said, "I love Florence." And by Florence, he not only means his country, but also all the political parts of Florence. "I love Florence," he says, "more than my own soul." I guess we could say that says something about him twice. A, what his priorities are, and B, presumably he thinks he has a soul. So we can take his religion or lack of religion into account. We need to remember it as we read, partly because of what's not there that we might traditionally expect to be there. Now, what I want to do for almost all the rest of this lecture is to talk about how Machiavelli specifically responds to certain classical authors and challenges or redoes or undoes much of what Cicero and Aristotle in particular have written. Let's begin in chronological order. I am a historian after all, with Aristotle, the great Greek philosopher of the 4th century BC. Aristotle argued that the state, the nation, the government is founded on friendship and trust. That is the basis of a community, of one of these Greek city-states, such as Athens, where Aristotle lived, although he was not a native. If you ask, what's the building block? Where do you start? What do you need to have a state and to have it work successfully? It is that you need a certain kind of bond between citizens, a bond that we would refer to in terms of friendship and trust. That's how states work. That's how states function. That's how they become cohesive. That's how armies stand together in the field of battle. But Machiavelli challenges this. Machiavelli argues that the basis of a state is the fear of the prince and its system of coercion. That is to say, the laws that say, do this or here's the punishment, or don't do this or here's the punishment. And so while Aristotle really talks about a kind of personal and moral basis of the state, for Machiavelli it is much more about fear and power. That's what holds people together. And it's important for us to understand that when Machiavelli makes these arguments about fear and about the coercion of law, he is in some ways challenging traditional views. You know, Aristotle, as I mentioned in an earlier lecture, unlike Plato and whatever, had come back in his writings into Western Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries. Therefore, Aristotle is already well integrated into Western thought before the Renaissance comes along. And even in 1300 or a little after, when Dante's writing the Divine Comedy, as I pointed out, what does he call Aristotle? Simply the philosopher. That's how deeply rooted Aristotelian ideas are in the Western tradition. It's almost, not quite, almost as if Aristotle says it, unless it is contradicted by the Bible, it must be right. That's not an unfair way to talk about the respect that Aristotle had. Machiavelli comes along and challenges that. Now, let's talk about the way Aristotle understands what we would today call political science. It was indeed an empirical science. You went out and you got data. When Aristotle was interested in how to understand city-states, he sent out a team of researchers to write down what we would call the constitutional histories of all the existing Greek city-states, to see, as he drew them all together, what they have in common, what things work, what things lead to injustice, and whatever. It's an empirical science, but the goal of that science is to discover what ought to be. Let me say that again. The goal of political science, as empirical as it is to find out what ought to be. Let's see how all these states work, and then let's see from that if we can say this is the way states ought to organize themselves. This is the way states ought to write laws. This is the way states ought to legislate. This is the way rulers ought to govern. That it has ultimately a purpose of designing a kind of ideal, a model, a perfect version of what a just state is. Of course, Machiavelli, too, is quite empirical. Again, The Prince and other works are full of examples, full of data, we might say, taken especially from the ancient world and from contemporary times. But Machiavelli is not doing this with the idea of saying, now let's take all that we've figured out, all we've gathered together, and argue how things ideally ought to work. Machiavelli's political science, if you will, is much more descriptive. Roll up your sleeve, guys. This is the reality. This is the way the world works. This is the way that things have to go. And you can't get wedded into a particular way of conduct because situations change. And what works in situation A will not work in situation B. You have to shift gears. And therefore, you have to be flexible because what you're interested in, what political science is interested in, is order and power. Not building some sort of model, but order and power. How things really work. How, if you are a prince, to stay a prince. And by staying a prince, you've got to be able to organize the world that you're governing in a way that will provide for your security and safety. And so, although there are certain similarities between Aristotelian political science and Machiavellian political science, at least in terms of gathering evidence and being empirical, the goals are quite different. Having said that, let me now turn to Cicero. Cicero in the 20th century has sort of declined, I guess we would say, as somebody who really belongs in that pantheon of the greatest of classical thinkers. Just sort of dropped a notch or two. We need to remember, before the 20th century, Cicero was one of the great authorities. When Dante creates his structure of hell, for example, we find out that what he does is combine two different ideas of evil, one based on Aristotle, one based on Cicero. Now, today, when people read that in the footnote, they say, gee, Aristotle, greatest philosopher ever along with Plato, Cicero, sort of a second-rater. But we need to remember, whether that modern judgment of Cicero is right or wrong, that Cicero had the highest reputation as a rhetorician and as a thinker. And he was particularly venerated during the Renaissance because he was the great Republican writer. He lived at the end of the Roman Republic and wrote a great deal that was about reflections on government. He even wrote a book called On the Republic. He wrote a book on duties. And these were primarily they're right at the top of the list of the great books you would have read had you been educated in Florence when Machiavelli was. So what I want to suggest is that one of the things that Machiavelli does in The Prince is he, maybe systematically is a little bit too strong, but maybe it's not. He really goes about destroying some of the basic Ciceronian precepts that really hadn't even been challenged during the Renaissance, that were simply accepted as the way things are. Let me give you some examples. Cicero argued that political leaders must exercise what we would call today, I suppose, the standard virtues, the four great classical virtues of wisdom, justice, temperance, and fortitude, and they needed to be honest and magnanimous. Those are things that made you a great man. Those are things that made you a great political leader. Cicero argued that political rulers must be loved because fear was insufficient to sustain power. You can't scare people into law and order. That the citizens must love their ruler if it is to be an organized and functioning and just state. So think about those two principles. Love is more important than fear, and a good prince exercises, if you will, writ large, the same virtues that he exercises as an individual. To put it another way, what makes you a good friend, a good neighbor, a good dad, a good husband, whatever, also makes you a good ruler. And vice versa. What makes you a bad friend would also make you a bad ruler. And therefore, there was one morality. Sometimes it was writ small, sometimes it was writ large, if you will, in capital letters, but it's the same basic morality. Machiavelli takes on those principles. He argues that a prince must be prepared to act immorally, lying, deceiving, and exercising cruelty. Because not to do those things, to be sort of, the Boy Scout leader, if you will, of a nation, was a formula for disaster, a formula for failure, a formula for disorder. And remember, as Machiavelli looks at his own world, it is a disordered world. There are factions within city-states. The Florentine government has just changed. The barbarians are running wild in Italy. So that when Machiavelli looks and says, what's going to bring order and stability, it's not Mr. Nice Guy, because that doesn't work. What princes need to do, when necessary, not just gratuitously, is to lie, to deceive, and to be cruel. Machiavelli also recognizes the need for leaders to be feared. We'll talk about one of the most famous lines in The Prince in a future lecture, where Machiavelli asks, is it better to be loved or to be feared? And of course, Machiavelli's answer is, ideally, it's best to be both. But that doesn't often happen, so it's better to be feared than loved. What we need to see is not that statement sort of blinking at us on the page. What we need to see is that Machiavelli is challenging an almost up to that time unchallenged principle of how you govern a state. What Machiavelli is doing, therefore, in this dismantling of Ciceronian ideas of leadership, what he's really doing, therefore, is this. He's saying that what makes a good man, or woman, but these are men who are rulers, what makes a person a saint, what makes a person a good dad, can be disastrous if that a leader exercises those virtues. That there is a kind of divorce, we might say, between personal and political morality. And that a prince must be willing to do what traditionally would be called immoral things, to be cruel, to lie, to deceive, to present image rather than reality to people. And in many ways, we can see this as a development, albeit not a necessary development, of what I talked about as the basic principle of the Renaissance, which is to create a kind of autonomous moral world on earth. This is the set of rules that helped me live better right here on earth, rather than seeing every rule on earth simply directed toward me getting to heaven. And therefore, Machiavelli is taking that Renaissance idea and applying it in a way that had never been applied before. There's also an autonomous morality, if you will, that exists for rulers above and beyond and different from and often in opposition to all of the personal morality. And very often it is for that reason that Machiavelli is referred to as the first modern man.